Well, welcome to our virtual lesson tonight. Hope you are well wherever you are and whenever you're watching this. And if you're watching it today, happy Father's Day. I hope you're either having a great Father's Day, or you've had a great Father's Day, or you will have a great Father's Day, all depending on when you're looking at it. So just to keep us going and keep us on track, today we are virtual, and we're starting really the second book, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, of this Mere Christianity, and again realizing that this was a set of radio broadcasts around World War II. And next week we will also be virtual and wrap up this second book, and we'll talk more about that later. Tonight what we're really looking at is the beginning of what Christians believe. It was a set of 5 broadcasts, and you see each one of the chapters, and it's really laying out the basics of Christianity. And tonight's going to be interesting because we're going to do a couple of things somewhat different. First is I'm actually using a video tonight that will go through the first chapter, the rival concepts of God, that first chapter, but it'll be one that basically I was trying to find something that would show how he separated these different ideas of God, these different concepts or rivals of God. And it really, sort of to give you a preview of what the end of this is going to be, if you think about our lesson in Supernatural, where we talked about the 3 basically rebellions that happened. The first, what we call the fall in Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve decided to go it their own and disobey God. Then you've got the flood, and that's the sons of God in Genesis 6, where everything became very corrupt that the Lord had to start over. And then third is the Tower of Babel, where all of the nations were spread out. And part of what Lewis talks about in this first chapter is what people believe. Do they believe in God or do they not? Are they an atheist, or do they believe in some concept of God? And I've got some stats that I'm going to share with you here at towards the end that we'll talk about that. And one of the points that he says is basically, as a Christian, we don't have to say that all religions are wrong. Now, we do have to say that Christianity is right, but there are bits and pieces of other religions that basically do point to God. And you know what? That makes sense when you think about the Babel incident, where God separated the nations. Well, those nations were being then ruled by the sons of God, basically Elohims that didn't do what they were supposed to do and became basically corrupt. Well, they were still following, as Satan follows, the pattern of God. Basically, they are trying to be like God, but be above God. That's Satan's big play. So it's interesting when we watch this first video. This first video is the first chapter, but the way it's done, I thought was pretty good, that it was worthwhile. And this will all tie together, I hope, at the end. So let's watch this first video, which is the first chapter. So if you have your Mere Christianity book and you want to follow along with the words, all you're going to get is a reading of the first chapter, but also with some visual, I guess for lack of a better term, doodlings. So let's watch this, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about it.
Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. The rival conceptions of God. I have been asked to tell you what Christians believe, and I'm going to begin by telling you one thing that Christians do not need to believe. If you are a Christian, you do not have to believe that all the other religions are simply wrong all through. If you are an atheist, you do have to believe that the main point in all the religions of the whole world is simply one huge mistake. If you are a Christian, you are free to think that all these religions, even the queerest ones, contain at least some hint of the truth. When I was an atheist, I had to try to persuade myself that most of the human race have always been wrong about the question that mattered to them most. When I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal view. But of course, being a Christian does mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, Christianity is right and they are wrong. As in arithmetic, there is only one right answer to a sum and all other answers are wrong, but some of the wrong answers are much nearer being right than others. The first big division of humanity is into the majority, who believe in some kind of God or gods, and the minority who do not. On this point, Christianity lines up with the majority, lines up with ancient Greeks and Romans, modern savages, Stoics, Platonists, Hindus, Mohammedans, etc., against the modern Western European materialist. Now I go on to the next big division. People who all believe in God can be divided according to the sort of God they believe in. There are two very different ideas on this subject. One of them is the idea that he is beyond good and evil. Now, we humans call one thing good and another thing bad, but according to some people that is merely our human point of view. These people would say that the wiser you become, the less you would want to call anything good or bad, and the more clearly you would see that everything is good in one way and bad in another, and that nothing could have been different. Consequently, these people think that long before you got anywhere near the divine point of view, the distinction would have disappeared altogether. We call a cancer bad, they would say, because it kills a man. But you might just as well call a successful surgeon bad because he kills a cancer. It all depends on the point of view. The other and opposite idea is that God is quite definitely good or righteous, a God who takes sides, who loves love and hates hatred, who wants us to behave in one way and not in another. The first of these views, the one that thinks God beyond good and evil, is called pantheism. It was held by the great Prussian philosopher Hegel and, as far as I can understand them, by the Hindus. The other view is held by Jews, Mohammedans and Christians. And with this big difference between pantheism and the Christian idea of God, there usually goes another. Pantheists usually believe that God, so to speak, animates the universe as you animate your body, that the universe almost is God, so that if it did not exist, he would not exist either, and anything you find in the universe is a part of God. The Christian idea is quite different. They think God invented and made the universe, like a man making a picture or composing a tune. A painter is not a picture, and he does not die if his picture is destroyed. You may say, he's put a lot of himself into it, but you only mean that all its beauty and interest has come out of his head. His skill is not in the picture in the same way that it is in his head or even in his hands. I expect you see how this difference between pantheists and Christians hangs together with the other one. If you do not take the distinction between good and bad very seriously, then it is easy to say that anything you find in this world is a part of God. But of course, if you think some things really bad and God really good, then you cannot talk like that. You must believe that God is separate from the world, and that some of the things we see in it are contrary to his will. Confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, "If you could only see it from the divine point of view, you would realize that this also is God." The Christian replies, "Don't talk damned nonsense." For Christianity is a fighting religion. It thinks God made the world, that space and time, heat and cold, and all the colours and tastes, and all the animals and vegetables are things that God made up out of his head, as a man makes up a story. But it also thinks that a great many things have gone wrong with the world that God made, and that God insists, and insists very loudly, on our putting them right again. And of course, that raises a very big question. If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? And for many years I simply refused to listen to the Christian answers to this question, because I kept on feeling, whatever you say, and however clever your arguments are, isn't it much simpler and easier to say that the world was not made by any intelligent power? Aren't all your arguments simply a complicated attempt to avoid the obvious? But then that threw me back into another difficulty. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliff.
Okay, that's pretty. It's a pretty cool little video. I think they have it on every chapter like that. So I will find the link to the playlist on YouTube and send that out in case you're interested. That may be your new way to basically watch watch all of these videos, or read your chapter, however you want to look at it. So let's look at a couple of things. First of all, I love the way that Lewis starts out this section. And again, you got to remember this was a radio broadcast. He says, "I have been asked to tell you what Christians believe. And I'm going to begin by telling you one thing that Christians do not need to believe. If you're a Christian, you do not have to believe that all the other religions are simply wrong all through." Gotta love that English little sayings. If you are an atheist, you have to believe that the main point in all the religions of the whole world is simply one huge mistake. You ever think about that? If you are an atheist, or if you have somebody that just basically denies the existence of God, they basically have to disagree with anybody that believes in any God. So they have to not only disagree with Christianity, but with everybody. Now, I'm going to read a section of a report from the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University, and it's the first year they've done this study, and it's George Barna who does a ton of work on faith and research. And in fact, I just got it in today. This is the American Worldview Inventory 2020-2021 report. So it's the first year that they've put this out. I haven't even had a chance to digest all of it. But the idea is, when we look at the way Lewis broke down, you either believe in a God or you don't believe in a God. And now, if you do believe in a God, what are the main sort of buckets of believing in a God? So let's look at just what the report says about basically this idea of, do you believe in a God or do you not believe in a God? And this is, again, talking about America, so it's U.S., not the whole world. But it says, groundbreaking new research about American faith and worldview shows that although we proclaim "In God We Trust" on our current currency, a slim, and this is so sad, 51% majority of Americans believe in a biblical view of God. That's down from 73% 30 years ago. Increasingly, the research finds mounting evidence that Americans are both redefining and rejecting God. Now, Lewis goes and talks about sort of the boyish, I think is how he called it, view of God, the watered-down version of Christianity in the second chapter. So think about that. We've got a redefining view of God and a straight-out rejection of God. So continuing to read his report, stunningly, Americans are more confident about the existence of Satan than they are of God. Overall, 56% contend that Satan is an influential spiritual being, yet almost half, 49%, are not fully confident that God truly exists. And 44% of believing Jesus Christ sinned, or believe that Jesus Christ sinned while on earth. Okay, so 44% of these people surveyed believe that Jesus sinned. Just to make that clear, since I sort of chewed that up a little bit. Americans are also confused about the nature of the Holy Spirit, with over half, 52%, saying that the Holy Spirit is not a living entity, but merely a symbol of God's power and presence or purity. Now, this is where it gets continuing stunning. According to the latest release of findings from the American Worldview Inventory 2020 by Dr. George Barton, Director of Research at the Cultural Research Center, some of the largest drops in belief in a biblical description of God in the last 30 years are among youngest Americans ages 18 to 29, dropping 26 points. Older Americans born before 1946 are down 25%. Women down 25 points. And the largest drop was among the attending Pentecostal or Charismatic Protestant churches, down 27 points. Only those in households with income at least 20% above the national average saw an increase of 2 points. Overall, the study found that 50% dropped in biblical worldview in America in the past 30 years, from 12% to the current 6%, the lowest number ever recorded. A lot of stuff there. I will send you this report so you can digest it. The full book, I think, costs $19, and you can take a look at it. The point being is this idea that Lewis put forth in this first set of radio broadcasts is this split between people that believe in God and people that don't believe in God. Atheist and basically, theist. And then the theist, he breaks up into a couple of different things. So it's as relevant today as when he wrote this, right around the beginning of World War II, 60, 70 years ago. So one of the biggest quotes, or one that I like the most, is this. when he gave the example of pantheism and the example of cancer. He said, confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, if you could only see it from the divine point of view, you would realize that this also is God. And the Christian would reply, don't talk damn nonsense, for Christianity is a fighting religion. Think about that today in our divided world, all right, where you get people that are from two different points of view, all right? And it really comes down to a point of view of, are humans bad at heart? Are they sinful, fallen creatures? Or are they good at heart? And the good person, the pantheist in this case, will sit there and say, hey, listen, there's good in everything. Well, not really. The definition of good and bad, as we've sort of seen from Lewis in the first in the first book, which was the first set of research or radio broadcasts, and then our first two sessions, was no, there is a good and there is an evil, and that is defined by God. So it's very relevant today. It's very relevant today in how we think and what our worldview is when we get things thrown at us from the world. So what do we believe? And that's really what this whole first or second book, or second set of radio broadcasts is all about. Now, I'm going to start doing this because, especially last week when we didn't know who the guy talking was, you're going to hear as we go into the video from Alistair McGrath, who is he's just got a bunch of D's around his name. Doctor of philosophy. He's also a theologian, and he teaches at Oxford. You can see, I'm not going to read his credentials, but he is an apologetics. He wrote Dawkins, delusion, Christianity's dangerous ideas. He's written a bunch of books. This is a brilliant man that is going to talk to us here. So, excuse me, we will take a look at the video, and then we'll talk about a couple of things, which is really wrapping into the title, especially, of the second chapter, which is how we think about things, the invasion, how Lewis puts it. But enjoy this video of our continuing discussion.
My external surroundings are beautiful beyond expectation, C.S. Lewis told his father in a letter just a few days after moving into his rooms at Magdalen College's new building. That was in October 1925. For the next 30 years, this would be where Lewis would prepare his lectures, hold student tutorials, and meet with his friends. Oxford's College of St. Mary Magdalene was founded in 1458. New building behind me was given its name after being completed 3 centuries later in 1733. So it was right here that Lewis was given a suite with a large sitting room which looked out over a deer park. He had a smaller sitting room and a bedroom. Those are 2 windows behind me that looked out over this broad manicured lawn to the college's main buildings.
You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England.
I gave in and admitted that God was God. The former Oxford atheist had come a long way. But what had brought Lewis to such a radical change from his former views? One way to answer this question is to simply say, as Lewis does, that God had been pursuing him steadily and unrelentingly. And one of the most important ways that God had pursued him was through the books that he read. Books by writers such as George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, and George Herbert. Lewis liked these authors for their wisdom and good sense in spite of what he considered to be their archaic Christian mythology. In Surprised by Joy, Lewis warns readers,
"A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of its reading. There are traps everywhere."
One of those traps was sprung on an afternoon shortly before Lewis yielded to God. Lewis was headed home on the top of a double-decker bus driving up Headington Hill. Sitting alone, not thinking about anything in particular, he was suddenly presented with the notion that he was holding something at bay, intentionally shutting something out. It was as though he was wearing a suit of armor, he later said, and in a moment of clarity, he felt that he was offered a free choice. He could unbuckle his armor or keep it on. He could open the door or keep it shut. Lewis writes that before the bus ride was finished, he'd made the choice to open, to unbuckle, to loosen the rein. There would be more choices and further steps to take as Lewis slowly came to admit that God was God. But the start happened in a calm, dispassionate choice made on the top of a bus going up Headington Hill. A small moment that had huge consequences. He was willing to follow the truth no matter where it might lead, even if it meant that God was God. In this session, we will see, along with Lewis, that atheism proved to be far more restrictive than Christianity. As an atheist, Lewis claimed that most of the human race was fundamentally wrong when it came to the most important questions about the universe and our place in it. When he became a Christian, he could see that when it came to other religions, as in arithmetic, some answers were much nearer to being right than others, and each might contain some hint of the truth.
As a young man, Lewis was an atheist. Why? Well, first of all, he thought this is what modern people believe. Religion is very much a thing of the past. But Lewis also was very, very clear in his own mind that atheism was the simplest way of looking at things. He knew there were alternatives, and he dismissed religion as being out of date, outmoded. He was a thinking young man. This is what everybody else seemed to be thinking. He bought into atheism in a very big way. Lewis fought in the First World War. He was wounded in battle in the British Army, and to him, the suffering of the First World War reinforced his atheism. Look, if there's a God, why doesn't he stop this mess? Why doesn't God intervene to stop all the suffering and pain that we're seeing all around us? And Lewis, I think, found that very compelling at the time. But during the 1920s, when he was a student at Oxford, Lewis began to rethink things. He began to realize that atheism was just too slick, too simple, that in many ways it didn't answer some of the deep questions. Lewis, I think, believed atheism made some kind of sense, but it didn't excite him. It didn't give him a reason to live. It didn't answer the deeper existential questions which were coming to the fore in his life. And he was beginning to realize there was also an intellectual issue. If there was no God, then who was to blame for the suffering of the First World War? And Lewis began to realize that as an atheist, he just dumped all the blame on God, but if there was no God, then the blame had to get dumped on human beings. And Lewis began to realize that atheism didn't have quite the intellectual resilience that he thought. So what were the options? Lewis began to think, look, is there a way of seeing things, a way of making sense of reality which is intellectually convincing, but also existentially satisfying. And Lewis's discovery of Christianity was due to many things. One of them was a conversation he had with J.R.R. Tolkien about the way in which stories give us an understanding of what reality is all about. And Lewis began to realize that if Christianity were true, then it offered a way of making sense of things which was far better than his atheism and also than all the religious alternatives he'd considered. Lewis began to speak about his glib and shallow rationalism as a young man, something that once seemed bold and bright and exciting and yet seemed inadequate when it began to be challenged by the complexity of the world. For Lewis, coming to the Christian faith was about discovering a way of seeing things which really made sense. And sure, there were what Lewis called shadowlands, that is, things that were shrouded in darkness or mist, which you couldn't see clearly. But Lewis realized you could see them far more clearly through a Christian lens than through any other way of thinking about them. Now, of course, for Lewis, and indeed for many of us, one of the most important issues here is the problem of suffering. If Christianity is right, well, how do we make sense of suffering in the world? And Lewis dealt with this question at two times and at two levels. Lewis was really concerned to deal with an intellectual question. How can the Christian faith make sense of suffering? But he began to realize also there was a second question. How can Christianity help me cope with suffering? That's a different question. That's an existential question. And Lewis began to realize that Christianity gave very good answers to both of those questions. He began to engage the first in his very well-known book, The Problem of Pain, which he wrote in 1940. And in this book, Lewis sets out this question. If there is a God, how do we offer an explanation for the existence of suffering in the world? And Lewis gives a very good account of why, as Christians, we can accommodate the reality of suffering inside our way of looking at things. And one of the points that Lewis makes is, I think, extremely important. His argument is that Christianity is unique in its way it approaches suffering. It doesn't just offer cheap explanations. It talks about a God who became incarnate. That is to say, a God who entered into this world of suffering and experienced suffering. And that changes everything. It's not just a way of understanding suffering. It's a way of realizing that Christianity is different in its thinking about God, a God who enters into the world, who experiences suffering in order to redeem us through suffering. But Lewis's experience of suffering took a new turn in 1960. Late in life, Lewis married Joy Davidman, and he loved her enormously. And then she developed cancer. And Lewis began to realize he was going to lose the woman who he loved. And she died in 1960. And Lewis was devastated. And in 1961, he wrote a little book called A Grief Observed, in which he talked about his experience of loss and his reflections on what this meant for his faith in God. And it's a very raw book. It's all about his experience of grief, of desolation at the loss of his wife. And as you read this book, you begin to realize Lewis is experiencing suffering and pain, not so much as an intellectual riddle, but as something that threatens to overwhelm him. He must be able to cope with this. And again, Lewis talks about how his Christian faith, and above all, the idea of a God who bears suffering for us, speaking to him in those moments of grief. Lewis reflects, he says, look, during my wife's final illness, I often found myself saying, I wish I could bear her suffering. I can't bear it, what she's going through. Surely I could take this away from her. Then he began to realize, isn't that exactly what happened in the incarnation? That Christ bore our suffering. And it didn't answer all of Lewis's questions, but it made him realize here was a sympathetic, caring God who entered this world to bear suffering and make it easier for us to cope with it as well. Now, why is this so important? Well, for Lewis, it's important in a number of ways. And here I think is the most important point to make. As a young man, Lewis was looking for a way of thinking, a way of seeing things, which would make sense of the world he saw around him and what he experienced within him. And he knew there were alternatives. There was atheism. There were Eastern religions. There were other non-Christian faiths, and there was Christianity. And Lewis initially dismissed Christianity as out-of-date, irrational nonsense. Atheism was the way ahead. But that was a rather premature judgment. And Lewis began to realize that it was simplistic rather than simple. And he began to realize that the complexity of the world demanded a rich and satisfying way of looking at it if you were going to make sense of it and act meaningfully within it. For Lewis, Christianity was like a lens that brought things into focus. It was like a light that illuminated a landscape so you could see things more clearly and see further than you otherwise could do. Now, Lewis was always clear there are going to be things that we don't fully understand, and maybe suffering's one of them. But Lewis's point is this, that the Christian lens brings things into focus far more effectively than everything else. And Lewis was a Christian not by inclination, but by conviction. He discovered this way of thinking that really made sense of the world around him and his experience within us. So Lewis is saying something I think very, very simple and very, very important. Look, we have intellectual options here. There's atheism, there's Buddhism, there's Islam, and there's Christianity. And Lewis was saying, look, it's not just because of cultural history that I have embraced the Christian faith. I've embraced it because it makes sense, because it gives me the most satisfying way of looking at things than I have ever hoped to discover. And Lewis is not being disrespectful of his earlier atheism or of other religious traditions. He was just saying, I have discovered a way of seeing things which makes sense, which is intellectually and imaginatively satisfying. And in that book of his, Mere Christianity, Lewis is saying, look, here is what I have discovered. It's wonderful. Maybe it's something you'd like to think about as well.
In Surprised by Joy, Lewis reports how in the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God. The account he gives surrounding that simple admission is infused with allusions from the New Testament. For example, Lewis refers to the prodigal son who at last came home on his own feet, and to the parable of the great banquet where the master compelled his guests to come in. In Lewis's statement, the hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, we hear echoes of the Apostle Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, where Paul tells us that the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men, and the weakness of God is stronger than the strength of men. For Lewis, acknowledging the wisdom of God over his own foolishness was a critical and humbling acknowledgement. Yet, it was only the beginning of Lewis's journey into Christianity. In the opening sentence of the very next chapter in Surprised by Joy, Lewis describes himself as the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. But what had he converted to? Not the fullness of Christianity, but to a form of theism, pure and simple. It would take another 2 years before he would yield to any acceptance of Christianity. So, what was the next step for the new convert to theism? Lewis tells us that he felt morally obligated to make some public statement of his change in beliefs. He writes, "I thought one ought to fly one's flag by some unmistakable overt sign." How exactly does a new theist, someone who believes only in God, pure and simple, fly his flag? Well, Lewis began attending weekday morning prayer services right here in the Magdalen College Chapel. He makes a point of telling us that he did this in spite of the fact that he did not yet believe in Christianity. More so, he recognized that the difference between his theism and Christianity was large and not to be taken lightly. So, why would Lewis choose to fly his flag of theism in this way, in what he acknowledges was a mostly symbolic action? In joining those who attended morning prayers here at the college chapel, Lewis would have joined people who shared his belief in God. They were Christian theists, and he was a pure and simple theist. By going to morning prayers, Jack wanted to make it clear to everyone that he was no longer an atheist. In this session, we explored some of the rival conceptions of God which people today may have. They may believe in a God found in nature, but not separate from it. They may believe in a God who is beyond our concept of good and evil. They may believe in the good and righteous God of Christianity, or in no God at all. In our next session, we'll explore the way the Christian concept of God differs from all these other beliefs by claiming that at a specific point in history, God himself landed on this enemy-occupied world in human form to teach us and to suffer and die for us.
So, as we try to put a bow on this, and it's a shame that we can't have the normal interaction that we do. I'd much rather talk to you than talk to my computer. But McGrath, in his book, made this comment that I think really leads us to the conclusion of this lesson. In his book, Glimpsing the Face of God, the search for meaning in the universe, he writes this, and it really matches up well with what Lewis has talked about in these two chapters. He says, Christian theology uses the language of fallenness to describe the state of affairs. The world has fallen away from its God-given goals. And I mean, that goes right to Genesis 3, with the fall of mankind. All of the things have crept into this world to deflect it from its original purposes. Hey, there you go. That's Genesis 6 and the flood. Now, keeping going with the comment, using words that parallel those of Lewis, McGrath concludes that our world is like a country that has been invaded by an occupating force. A country which recalls its days of freedom in the past and eagerly awaits its liberation in the future. And that's what we're getting at here when we talk about the Christian belief. There's a lot of doctrines, there's a lot of things that we have to go through. We have to understand what Jesus did for us on the cross. It's, I go back to last week and the statement that basically Hamlet could not know Shakespeare unless Shakespeare wrote himself into the play. And that's really what Jesus did when he came. He wrote himself, God wrote himself into his creation, into this drama that is our day-to-day life. In Genesis 3, our Adam and Eve fell. That sin nature then of understanding good and evil came to us. The badness of the fallen angels that came into the sons of God that came into the daughters of man and created just basically depravity. Well, that's Genesis 6 that led to the flood. And then this idea of we're gonna try to reach for heaven ourselves by building a tower, and God had to separate the nations and separate us into our own language. Well, this is the world we live in. This is why the world we live in is like it is. And so they talk a lot. McGrath talked a lot about about Lewis's conversion and the joy that he found, the surprising joy, which is his autobiography. And by the way, if you can, I don't know if it's if it's out there on like Netflix or Amazon or whatever, but there was a stage play called The Reluctant Convert, which really goes through Lewis's conversion. If you can watch that sometime, it's well worth it. I know I had it on Faith Life TV. That's what I watched it on. But it really goes to this idea of finding joy, but then realizing that there's suffering in the world, and that the suffering in the world is answered through Christianity on both levels. Why there is suffering in the world, and what can we do about it? But I think this idea of there's an invasion going on, that there is a battle, we're in occupied territory, really goes to the idea that we are in a spiritual battle. We are in spiritual warfare, and we have to understand what we believe, and we have to understand what the enemy is trying to do. Part of this spiritual warfare is our own human nature, where we're fighting the internal battle against the old nature. But part of it is true spiritual warfare, where suffering comes from, where bad things, are allowed to happen because of this fallen world. It's not the way it's supposed to be. And this idea of a battle raging, not between equally powerful dualism forces. In the second chapter of Book 2, he talks about dualism, but he talks about the really faulty thinking of dualism, which is if there's a good and there's an evil, we have to know what good is and what evil is, and those forces, they're not equal. They're not equal. But we are in a spiritual battle. That spiritual battle is raising, and basically, as we see division in our own country and in our own world today, that is nothing more than a tactic of Satan. And we get that in the church today. So this understanding of what our beliefs are very, very important. And that's really the point of tonight's lesson. It's setting up what we believe as Christians. And we'll continue it next week with the next 3 chapters of Book 2. So we will be virtual again next week. I'll probably be recording this from a campsite in San Antonio. It'll be great with 3 dogs. I imagine that'll be an interesting time recording it. But if you read ahead, you've got the 3 chapters to read. And one of the things that I would suggest is we are off we have this chapter next week, or this lesson 4 next week, and then we are off for 4th of July. The next lesson, which is I believe it's the 11th of July, it's a lot more reading, so you might want to make sure you get ahead on that one. But that is all there is tonight. Miss seeing you in person. Do not like looking into a little green light from a camera standpoint to record this, but I think it was still great. I hope you enjoyed it. We will see you next week. I hope again that you have a great Father's Day and a great week, and until we see each other coming up in a couple of weeks, may God be with you, and may God bless you. Take care.